But first, the basic principles of motivational interviewing. These are all kind of two words that begin with the same letter for the purposes of helping us to remember. So starting with expressing empathy. What does that mean? Expressing empathy. What does that mean? Well, in our engagement module, we talked in some depth about the Carl Rogers approach to therapy that was popularized back in the 50s. Expressing empathy was one of those Rogerian, one of those approaches that he made popular. And it really has to do with how do we connect with the person. It has a lot to do with that alliance factor that we talked about when we talked about engagement and therapeutic relational factors, evidence-based relational factors. It involves things like being non-judgmental, of exhibiting unconditional positive regard to the person, no matter what they're telling us, no matter what kind of mood they're in, no matter what they have and haven't done, we maintain unconditional positive regard. We, in a genuine and authentic way, we extend warmth and acceptance and understanding. Those are part of expressing empathy, and it involves not just our verbal behavior, but our nonverbal behavior as well. And especially when it comes to authenticity, many of the folks that we serve have pretty good radar about how genuine we're being or how fake we're being, and can pick that up through our verbal and our nonverbal behaviors. So it's really important to be secure in ourselves that we're being genuine and that we're not trying to fake something, and to be intentional about expressing that. So expressing empathy is absolutely one of the concepts, one of the basic principles of motivational work. We want to connect as meaningfully as soon as possible with the folks we work with, because that therapeutic rapport is the foundation upon which everything else good happens that's going to happen. A second basic principle is, and these are not in any particular sequence or order, but developing discrepancy. What's meant by that? Well, part of the art and science of motivational interviewing, motivational enhancement work is with our client being the source of the data, identifying what it is that that person views as important in terms of their values or goals, those intrinsically motivating factors, identifying what those are, and then in a very gentle and respectful way, noticing the discrepancy, the disconnect between those goals and values and their using behavior, or the things that their using behavior is, contributing to having in their life. Okay, so an example might be, a single mom who currently has custody of her child, but the family court is very concerned because of her substance involvement for the welfare of the child, and she's at risk of losing, her child being taken from her custody and placed in foster care, for example. That single mom might tell you that she's very, very much dedicated to being a good mother, right? Let's say she didn't have a good mom herself, and she realizes in retrospect the incredible value and worth and importance of being a good mother for her child. So she may talk about that as a value, as an intrinsically motivating factor, and yet at the same time she's abusing substances or caught up in abusing substances in a way that's putting her at risk of her child being taken away. That would be an example of discrepancy, that as you get to know that person and where they're coming from and their circumstances and their history, you kind of can't help but notice that, okay, kind of seems like out of one side of their mouth they're saying, I really want to be a good mother, but out of the other side of their mouth, the actions of their life are saying, but I'm involved in things that make it look to the court, family court, like I'm not a fit parent. That's a discrepancy. And it's not our job to brutally, confrontationally bring that to that person's attention in some kind of obnoxious way. But what this suggests is, as part of motivational work, we do want to lead that person to connecting those dots for themselves. We want to lead them to realizing that there is a disconnect there, right? Not for the purposes of judging or shaming or ridiculing that person, not at all, but rather for the purpose of helping to activate and strengthen that core intrinsic motivation of wanting to be a good mom, such that that gains so much power and is connected in her cognitive thinking so strongly to her other behaviors that that motivates her to change the behaviors that she needs to in terms of seeking sustainable recovery from her addiction. So that would be an example of developing discrepancy. And certainly cultural considerations matter here. We shouldn't make assumptions about what is important to people. We shouldn't make assumptions about what somebody's goals or values are. They're going to differ from person to person. In many cases, the values and goals and intrinsic motivating factors of your client are going to be different from yours. And I think all of us start from a beginning position of assuming that, oh, the stuff that's important to me is also important to other people. The stuff that's, valuable to me, that motivates me, is also that way to other people, and it's not necessarily the case. So we need to suspend assumptions or until we find out directly from the person we're working with what those internally motivating factors, values, goals really are for that person. I'll give a quick example of a lesson that I learned in this regard. I was working with a client who was unstably housed, and he would commit misdemeanor crimes, which included open intoxicant in the park, for example, public urination after he's, under the influence, that sort of thing, and he would end up in jail. And I made an assumption that, jail's not a good place to be. If I was him, I wouldn't want to be in jail. I value my freedom very highly. And so I would work as a case manager at the time to get him out of jail, or get the conditions of his incarceration amended such that he could get out on probation, because I was imposing my value of freedom from jail onto him without finding out if that was a value that he had. Well, as it turned out, it really wasn't. And he was actually intentionally, strategically committing misdemeanor crimes about every fall because he was unstably housed and the cold weather was coming. For him, it was a strategic decision to go to jail for the winter. So he would commit misdemeanor crimes, get 3 months, 90 days in jail, November, December, January, or December, January, February, have 3 hots and a cot, have his stable housing, issue settled for those 90 days. He would do that intentionally because he didn't really care that much that it was in a jail. He cared more that he wasn't out, living on the street or unstably housed with really hostile, family members. So that was his values. And until I got to know him well enough and was open enough to learning that, I didn't know that. And when I didn't know that, I was, busting my butt to get him out of jail when he didn't want to get out of jail. He wanted to be in jail during the cold weather for that reason. Now that learning that raised some other, targets, right? Is there a way to get him stably housed so that he didn't have to be in jail as his housing solution and so on? But that's just an example of how we really need to learn about what the values are of the person and the priorities of the person that we're working with, and not assume that they're exactly like our own. So avoiding arguing. There's something that's written and talked about in motivational work called the righting reflex, right? And a lot of us who are in the helping professions, we have that righting reflex. What is that talking about? Well, what it's talking about is we care about people, and part of us is strongly, compelled to help solve problems and kind of resolve situations, right? So when we come across something that's disordered, there's a part of us that wants to restore it to order, okay? And that's known as the righting reflex. We want to make it right. But what good, effective motivational work takes into account is that if we're exercising that righting reflex with somebody who's not yet action stage ready to have that part of their life made right or put back into order, then we become yet another manifestation of the action stage ready practitioner, who's working with the less than action stage ready client, and the outcome is predictable. It's not effective, okay? So avoiding arguing is really in part a recognition that sometimes, maybe many times, an argument or a conflict with our client is caused by us racing ahead of where that person is at in terms of their readiness to change, or moving too quickly in the direction of a treatment or recovery strategy, such that we're outpacing the slower pace that our client is taking because of where they're at and everything that they're dealing with. And so arguing in the motivational interviewing kind of framework is to be avoided pretty much at all costs, right? It's understood that it takes two to argue. And if one person refuses to argue, argument doesn't happen. So what happens when we're provoked? Well, we need to do a good job of managing our own emotions. We need to regulate our responses well so that we're not kind of triggered into arguing back. What if somebody's behaving inappropriately? Well, we can set appropriate boundaries and discontinue the conversation or discontinue the session, or ask somebody, exit somebody from group if it's happening in a group setting. We don't have to tolerate inappropriate behavior that brings a threat of harm to you, yourself, that person, or somebody else. And we don't want to reinforce it by tolerating it or enabling it either. So this is not saying to just take it, but what it is saying is arguing back has a predictably negative outcome. It takes the focus and it moves it away from where it needs to be. Where does it need to be? It needs to be on the problem, the person's problem with substance abuse and everything that surrounds that. The minute you make the problem about your interpersonal conflict, you're taking the focus off the real problem and putting it over here in a way that distracts from the real problem and diverts precious time and energy and runs the risk of impairing or rupturing the relationship, the therapeutic rapport, in a way that's going to take more time and energy to repair if you go there and do that, or it may end up contaminating the therapeutic relationship so significantly that repair isn't workable and the person just drops out, none of which are desirable outcomes. There's a YouTube video here. I'm not going to toggle to it, but if you want to give yourself a little bit of humorous relief, this is actually a Monty Python skit that they have this argument clinic, and it kind of makes the case about arguing is kind of pointless and a waste of energy and time. So I'm a big Monty Python fan. I know maybe some younger folks watching have no idea who Monty Python is, but if you're curious, check out this link. It's on YouTube, and enjoy it. It's a couple minutes long and it's kind of funny. So the other part of avoiding arguing, this third bullet point or fourth bullet point here, is that the goal of motivational work is to help lead and support your client to be the one who argues for change, to be the one from whose mouth change talk is coming, right? We've already said it doesn't work well for the practitioner to argue for change with the ambivalent person. So how can we more skillfully and subtly help our person move to the point where they're the ones articulating the argument for change? And then our job is easy. We recognize that, we reinforce it, we strengthen it in every way we can, we validate it, we reinforce it, we reflect it back, and we'll talk about some of those techniques next. But we're not the one initiating the change talk, the argument for change. Rather, we're skillfully leading our client to be the one who's talking the change talk and making the argument for change. And we'll get much more deeply into that as we go forward.